Okay, we previously looked at search terms with regard to presidential debates, 2016 and 2020. We're going to look a little deeper into additional search terms. One of the questions that has arisen with regard to the election are people voting based on what they love or what they hate or dislike strongly. So we can look at terms. This range here is from the year of the last election cycle. So we're looking at 2016 up to roughly an 11-month period. And the terms we're looking at here are love Clinton, love Trump. We can see that Trump has an 18-7 differential in terms of the overall average, relative average between the two. And we can try Hillary as well. So again, the question here, does private search behavior better predict voting behaviors, particularly controversial voting behaviors? So given the modern circumstances of how news cycles run and political cycles run, which has the greater predictive validity? Private search data or polls? And of course, we already know the outcome of the last election, so it's very easy to line up pattern correlates and say, well, this matches with what happened. So you can't take things in isolation. You want to look to see if it's replicated. So that's why seeing what happens in this election cycle will be very interesting in terms of the patterns. So for some context, let's also look at this year. This year we have love Biden, love Trump. And we can see that differential is even wider. 46-9. So again, here's last election cycle. Here's this election cycle. So that gap has widened considerably relative between the two candidates. And so looking at some additional terms, we have love Sanders, love Trump. So there's, of course, Bernie Sanders. And Trump comes out ahead except for this period here. So something around September, the week of September 22nd and 28th of 2019. Huge jump. I think he dropped out around April. So let's look at Sanders to Biden. But again, here's that period. Something happened there. And so he dropped out, I think, around April 10th or something. And then Biden obviously became the candidate. So we can also look at the comparison in terms of hate Biden, hate Trump. And again, we see that huge differential. So what happens if we compare hate Biden with hate Trump, love Trump? So let's see which search term has dominance. So we'll start with love Biden. Okay. And then we will love Trump search. Okay, so we know that. And now we're going to put in hate Biden. And you can see, well, one thing we see here is that this correlates together. Love and hate Biden follow an overall similar trend, and probably the same will happen with Trump. We see these correlate, maybe not surprisingly. So if we see a trend like this, then it follows to wonder what are some of the possible interpretations or explanations. Whatever's spiking these points here, something that's causing, on one interpretation, is causing both polls to reach to Google, those who really love them and those who really hate them. If some trigger event occurs, and then both forces might show up to the fray, as it were. And here we can see that the dominant term of these four is love Trump. Then in second place is hate Trump. Then love Biden and hate Biden. So overall, people don't take the time to hate Biden in their Google search behavior, relatively speaking, of course, compared to what is being generated online, either love Trump or hate Trump. Biden isn't getting the same relative interest either way. So aside from psychometrics in terms of the psychology I think that's consistent with the idea that Trump is a dominant psychological figure. So relatively speaking, people don't take a lot of their private search behavior to devote it to hating Joe Biden. But they do take the time to hate Trump in their search behavior, and they definitely take the time to love Trump during their search behavior. But overall, those differentials are very substantial. And based on this, the dominant search behavior term is love Trump. Will that actually correlate then to what happens in the private confines of voting booths? So one natural question, does this suggest then that even on the Democratic side, they're not actually very enthusiastic about Joe Biden? They don't actually really love him as a candidate. And that certainly has been suggested. This is consistent with that type of interpretation. But of course, we don't actually know what the outcome of the election is going to be. And so to reiterate the difference here, one of the points that is constantly trying to be ingrained to students is that there is a difference between causation and correlation. Because patterns correlate does not mean that you can infer the cause. The question is it a predictive correlate? And on the surface, those points can seem very similar, and that's part of the reason that this error is so frequently made as we do analysis, interpreting data. Climate change is an example of this. One of the debates is the correlation between rising CO2 and temperature. And on one hand, you have people making the argument that what happens is temperature rises and then CO2 rises. And one of the reasons, for example, is it warms the oceans, and then as large bodies of water, like the ocean, become warmer, they can hold less CO2, and so CO2 comes out of solution, and so you're going to get a rise in CO2. Now, the argument is that while that happens, so in the pattern you see that both are rising, or they both correlate with each other, but the temperature rise leads the CO2 rise. So the temperature rises, then CO2 rises. So people often attempt to use that as an argument to suggest that CO2 doesn't actually cause the temperature to rise. But what that doesn't always consider is that both can be happening. Temperature rise can cause CO2 to rise, CO2 can cause temperature to rise, which is triggering a warming feedback mechanism, which then is now going to warm the oceans, which is then going to warm it even further. So the root cause still is the concern that the additional fossil fuels, carbon dioxide from burning them, has provided the impetus to begin the feedback chain. At that point, the oceans take over, and then it looks like the oceans are responsible for what's happening on this feedback loop, and then that kind of camouflages the actual trigger event. And by event, maybe we could refer to it as the circumstances of the impetus, the point at time when a particular influencing impetus state exists, which then, as a whole, is called an event. And so it's actually very important to consider all the scenarios, which also can be quite a headache because of how many things are happening at the same time often. When it comes to running political systems or countries, the amount of factors and mediating factors can be so immense that the brain naturally wants to simplify the complexity into more simple narratives. From like a George Kelly perspective, we want a paradigm that's able to predict outcomes well, and so the brain wants to be able to find a way to house incoming information within a predictive paradigm, which is not unlike many of the things that Piaget was saying. So an argument with political polls is not just that they have lower predictive validity, but the manner in which that they are used to try and influence or affect election outcomes, because we're such group creatures that if you can broadcast information that is designed to tell someone who's undecided what the majority of the group is doing, that will imbue a sort of social pressure to conform. From a scientific perspective, in theory, the idea is that truth and honesty doesn't give an advantage to one side or the other. Accuracy is the thing that we're after, and consistency. And both sides are sort of fairness inflation, if you will. you can lie on both sides and cut each other's campaign down, or you can tell the truth on both sides, and truth can be just as positively co-beneficial to either side as reputational smearing or other forms of relational aggression strategy in terms of trying to manage perceptions and ultimately election outcomes. So polls historically can be useful, but they can also be used to try and manipulate. And one way or another, that's probably always been an element that's been involved in polling. But the research question is, what is the relative predictive validity between internet search behavior and public polls, particularly considering that voting, again, is a private behavior?